date is March 1st, 2023, and we're right here with Santi Vibul. Santi Vibul is a general surgeon in Evansville, Indiana. He practiced here for many years, and he was born in the country of Thailand. And we're going to get to his family history, his grandparents, and then his dad and his mom, and talk about Thailand, and we're going to eventually get to Thailand in World War II, but we need to learn a little bit more about the country of Thailand. I'm going to show you a picture of Thailand right now. This, Santi gave this to me, and if you see Thailand in this picture, right where my thumb is, this is the city of Bangkok. Santi's dad grew up till age 5 to 10 north of Bangkok, and then he moved to Bangkok at a young age. And we're going to talk about his grandparents. And then later in the war, this is a map of Thailand. The pointer is on Bangkok. About 100 miles north of there, Santi, what was the name of where your grandpa or your dad was born? What's the name of that city?
Cha Chung Sao.
Chung Sao.
Cha Chung Sao.
Cha Chung Sao. About
It
100.
had another name, Pat Riu, which means 8 rivulets.
8 rivulets.
Yes, it's confluent of waterways.
Waterways. And they grew up on a river there, and we'll talk about that a little bit. And just a general outline back to the map, he grew up and spent from age 5, lived with an attorney there after his mother said okay, and then grew up as a very smart child. And we'll talk about the King's test and then test for the Army and where he went after that. But then northeast of there, when during World War II, he took his family, and this is where Santi grew up early age, was Racha Misa. Santi was born in 1935, but he had a lot of his time there. So let's start. We've got the outline of Thailand, and let's just go back to your grandpa, and let's talk about your grandpa and your grandma north, and tell just about what your grandpa did. He died in early age, and then you get to your dad. Go ahead, Santi.
My grandfather was a what's the word?
An herbalist, a doctor. He was an herbalist, yeah.
And actually had 5 kids. My father had an older brother and a younger brother. My grandfather died from an abscess on his face. I suspect it could have been a cavernous sinus thrombosis or something without antibiotics. One day when he was about 10 years old, a cousin or his mother's nephew came to visit. He came by steamboat, which was quite a luxury in those days, and met my father and his older brother and told my grandmother that these 2 boys will never amount to much unless they go to Bangkok. In those days, Bangkok was very centralized. Everything happened in Bangkok. And my grandmother was willing to let the 2 boys go to Bangkok with this cousin. They stayed at the home of a lawyer who was apparently quite prominent. Their duty was to be
Do everything around the house.
Everything around the house, and also go to school. They were there for about a number of years. In those days, to finish their high school. In those days, the only way to go abroad as a student would be to win the King Scholarship. The King gave one scholarship a year to a high school graduate, and you could study any subject you want, and you could go to either France, Germany, England, or the United States. So it was very competitive. My father sat for the exam and ranked 5 or 6, but that wasn't good enough. It was only one place in the scholarship. So he decided to redo his 4th year in high school, and he sat in the teacher's workroom for the whole year, redoing all the problems again, and then sat for the second time and found out that he came out about 3rd or 4th, but that still wasn't good enough. And he started to study in the same classroom. It was actually the teacher's workroom. When the Air Force announced that they were giving 3 scholarships for an engineering degree, and he decided it was more advantageous, that the chance of winning a seat in 1 out of 3 was greater than one place in the scholarship, in the King Scholarship. So he sat for the exam and was one of 3 to come to any of the school. No, to take the Air Force exam. I'm sorry, I'm having.
No, take the Air Force exam. That's good. So he and 2 other Thais were sent to the U.S. Now, in those days, the Thai government had an advisor to His Majesty the King students. Keep going. Yeah. So he was the advisor to the King's students,
The advisor was in Washington, yes. And
D.C.
He would select the schools for the students to go to, and they broke them up. They didn't let all 3 go to one school because then they wouldn't speak English. So he sent my father to Mercersburg Academy in Mercersburg, Pennsylvania. In those days, that was a boys' school. And he sent the 2 others to 2 private schools, one in Massachusetts and I think one in New York. They were supposed to study in the American high school for 2 years before going to MIT. At the end of the first year, my father attended Camp Red Cloud in upper New York State, which was a tutoring service. And at the end of the summer, the advisor, one of the instructors, wrote to the advisor in Washington saying that my father and another Thai were doing very well, and they did not need to repeat the 4th year high school, that they should be able to pass the entrance exam, the college board exam. So
what year was this about, Santi? About after World War I?
it would be late 1920s.
So about between 28 and 29.
Something like that.
Before the Great Depression.
I think it was, well, I'm not sure. But he then, he and another Thai fellow then sat for the college board, and they both passed with flying colors.
And they had to take it in English too, didn't they? They had to take it in English.
You take it in English.
Did
And
you
my
speak
father-
English in Thailand? Did they speak much English?
Not well. The schools taught English, but I don't know how.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. So then he got into college, and tell us
Got
about
to college.
well, tell you
Now,
what he.
the entrance exam. My father and the Thai guy had the highest score in mathematics for that year's college board. I'm probably not understandable because they had 3 years of senior high school. So they both entered MIT, and there was another fellow who had the previous year's scholarship, but he was in England, and he transferred and came to MIT. So there was a group of 3 Thais studying engineering. There was one of them studied airplane engines, another one studied aerodynamics, and the third one studied electrical engineering for communications. They all graduated at the end of 4 years. The Air Force decided that the one with the highest score should do his master's degree. So my father did not have the highest score. He and the other Thai went to work in aircraft factories. My father went to Curtis Wright in Patterson, New Jersey, and the other Thai was up north somewhere in New York.
Yeah, Curtis Wright's one of the famous airplane companies in the United States. So your dad, did he take? He did. What kind of engineering did he take? Airplane engineering or airplane aerodynamics or?
According to him, he and the one Thai were sitting on the side watching, or they were playing soccer. And the one Thai guy said he didn't like the subject of engine design. Or my father said, well, he didn't like aerodynamics.
Uh-huh.
So they traded.
Yes.
So my father became well known later on for engine engineering.
Mm-hmm. And so then they Then he spent time at Curtis at the Curtis.
With the right.
Curtis, and then how long did he work there before he came
He
back to
worked
Thailand?
a year
1 year.
and came back.
Sort of an internship, yeah.
Yes, went back to Thailand.
He come back to Thailand. You're born in 35, so he probably came back to Thailand in 33 or 34.
Right.
You the oldest boy?
I'm the only boy, the oldest.
And about girls? You got any girls?
We've got 2 sisters, twins,
And they're younger than you.
a year younger.
So if he came back in 35, he came back earlier than 35 if you're born in 35.
Probably 33. Also. Now, while at MIT, he met my mother. That's another story.
Was she from Thailand?
No, my mother from France.
France. Tell us about her so we know a little bit about her as we get to this and where she
My
evolved.
mother came to the United States when she was 2 years old. Wow. Her mother had decided that my grandfather in France was tasting too much of his wine that he was producing. So she ran away from home with 3 kids, aged 4, 3, and 2, from France and came to Chicago. I have a page from the documents of her arrival of Ellis Island, and she had $400 with her. Anyway, she stayed in the Chicago area for 14 years before falling in love with a Hungarian man, and he went back to Europe. And my grandmother decided to go to Europe. So she took all 3 kids, which by then my mother said they were about ready to get their first papers become citizens. She took all 3 kids to Europe with her and found out that the guy was married. So she had nothing to do with him. This was in the middle of World War I. She died, she had TB of the kidney, and she died in Budapest, leaving the 3 kids in Budapest. The aunt wrote to her father in France, and he sent the money to go back to France. But she forgot to mention that the brother was there too. So the brother had to sweep the streets of snow to make a living. In the meantime, he found out that if he joined the German army, they would send him back home to Alsace before drafting him. So that's what he did. He went to a German recruiter and told him that he was 18 years old when he was only 17. And they sent him back to Strasbourg, France, for a few weeks, and then he joined the German army. Now my mother, in the meantime, had gone back to France and did I think a year of high school before graduating, and then I went to nursing school and worked as a nurse in Alsace, weighing babies. She visited different homes where there were new babies. I had always wondered why my mother's calves looked like a soccer player's calves. They were real muscular until I went back to visit her friends, and they showed me the cities or towns that she would frequent, and these were all uphill, downhill, and that she had a bicycle and would visit all these towns. In the meantime, the French decided they wanted to do something about social work. So they sent my mother back to the States to study at Simmons, and she studied social work at Simmons.
Where's Simmons?
Simmons is in Boston, Simmons College in Boston.
All right.
That's where my mother met my father. My mother was dancing with a Thai fellow. And every time around the circuit, he'd wave to somebody. And my mother said, "Who's that?" He said, "Oh, that's a friend of mine." "Why is he hiding in the dark?" "Well, he doesn't know how to dance." My mother said, "Introduce me to him and I'll teach him how to dance."
That was your daddy?
That was my dad. So when my mother graduated and went back to France, and a year later my father followed. And he stopped in England, in France, in Italy to visit different aircraft factories. And in France he visited my mother and then went back to Thailand. And about 6 months later, he wrote to my mother asking her if she wanted to join him in Siam. That was the name then.
It was a name of Thailand then,
Thailand.
and it changed its name.
Right.
Yeah.
And my mother had guts. She went to Siam. She told one friend out of 6 or 8 of them where she was going and asked her to promise not to tell anybody, because if it didn't work out, she was going to come back to France and pretend nothing happened. She went to Thailand where she got pregnant.
With you?
That was me.
Yeah.
So there was no way of going back to France. Now my father, after working after school, his degree was not in aeronautical engineering, it was in mechanical engineering. Because MIT did not offer a degree in aeronautical engineering at that time. This was probably 1932 or something like that. My father joined the Air Force along with the two other Thais, and they were possibly the core of the engineering department. My father was in charge of repairs, and the headquarters and the main workshop was in Bangkok. But then when World War II broke out, the Air Force moved the whole engineering department up north to a city called Nakhon Ratchasima.
Yeah, we showed that before. If I show you that, this is a map. I'm trying to get it straight here. I'm going to turn it down here. So it's 100 miles north of Bangkok here, where Santi says his dad, and he grew up there at the beginning there. There it is. Let me just show you the, it's about, we looked at the kilometers, it's about 150 miles. This is Bangkok right here, and they would go up to the northeast of there, probably 150 miles. And the name of that town is
Nakhon Ratchasima.
Ratchakanasina. Yeah, and that's where Santi grew up a little bit.
2 years.
You were there 2 years from 41 to 43. 1941 to 43 about. Because the war broke out September.
41.
Yeah. And so Thailand, if you look Thailand, correct me if I'm wrong, Santi, but Thailand, this whole big country changed from Siam to Thailand. What year did it change its name?
In the late 30s.
Late 30s. It was a monarchy until 1932, and then it changed from a monarchy to
Constitutional monarchy.
Yeah. And then if you look at the surrounding lands up above, it's got Vietnam, Laos, and Burma. And some of those lands used to be owned by Siam. And so the Thailand was trying to stay neutral during the pre-World War II, but with the bombing, it looked like they had to become on the Japanese side. And so they stayed that way till about 44, from 41 to 44. And there were two big parties. There was a Free Party, and then there was a Pinkham Party, or he was sort of in charge, one other party. They favored the Japanese during that period of time. But if you look down south of here, remember this is not right on the Burmese trail that went over the Himalayas, but the Americans helped the Chinese. That's north of here, and China was becoming invaded tremendously by Japan and moved their capital a couple times to the westerly direction. So Santi, we're going to talk now with Santi's dad right in the middle of it, probably one of the most educated people in the Thailand Air Force, being an engineer, trained at MIT, and then had a year at Curtis, and then looked at several plants in Europe. So let's tell them about your experiences those 2 years during World War II, and we'll just, from when you moved up there, and just tell us what you did and tell us what went on.
Pearl Harbor Day, the same time the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, they also established 5 or 6 beachheads in Thailand. In Thailand it was December 8th. Pearl Harbor, I think, was December 7th.
That's great.
With the time difference. The Japanese, the Thais were fighting the Japanese for 2 or 3 days, but all they had fighting the Japanese were policemen, Boy Scouts, and paramilitary. After 2 or 3, in the meantime, the Thais got in touch with the British in Singapore, and asked if the British could be of any help. I think the British said, "Sorry, old boy, you got to help yourself."
So British weren't helpful, so Thailand had to make decisions. Japanese ran over them in a couple days or a few days because they had no defense.
The English were boasting that they had artillery and all that, but the guns could not turn inland. They were all facing the sea, and the Japanese were coming from the north through Malaysia and got into Singapore without any difficulty. Now, the initial agreement, the Japanese said, "We just want to pass through." And that was saving face, and the Thai said, "Okay, we'll let you pass through." A while later, the Thai decided they would side with the Japanese.
They wanted to pass through to go to Burma, is what they wanted to do. Is that where they were
Go
trying
to
to
Malaysia and Singapore.
Singapore, Malaysia,
south, right.
down south, more
Down
than
south.
Burma. They wanted to get all the
Burma,
ports
they
down.
would get through India.
Right, yeah.
Then the Prime Minister, who was a dictator, had a cabinet meeting, and he then instructed the Thai ambassador in Washington to declare war on the United States. The Thai ambassador went to the State Department and said, Mr. Secretary, I have in my pocket instructions to declare war on the United States and Britain, but I consider the order illegal and therefore null and void, and I will not give you the letter. So they set up a free Thai government in the U.S. and in England. And the Thai students who were studying in the States and in England at the time then became members of the Free Thai movement and parachuted into Thailand, where they set up an underground movement.
Some writings say there was as many 90,000 that were in the Free Thai government. A lot of following in that Free Thai government to fight against the dictator.
Yes. And then we were in the Air Force compound where Air Force officers, engineering officers all lived together in one big compound. We had our tonsils removed by a friend of the family's, and my parents invited him over for dinner. And halfway through the dinner, guards were running through the whole neighborhood saying, "Planes coming, douse your lights. And my father said, "It's a dark night, no moon. How can planes be bombing us?" Well, they did bomb us, and they set flares. My father had never seen flares before. It lit up the whole area, and bombs started falling. The last one was pretty darn close to our shelter. At that point, Bangkok was being bombed as well, so the Air Force decided that they would move the repair shop up to Nakhon Ratchasima, and that's where the whole Air Force workshop moved up there.
After they were attacked in Bangkok.
Bangkok.
So they were attacked there first. I see. And the Japanese must have dropped flares. They knew where the Air Force was. They dropped flares, then they dropped the bombs at the flares.
Right, the American planes dropped flares.
Oh, the American planes, because the Americans bombed
That lit up the whole
The
area.
Americans bombed you, not the Japanese. The
No, the
Americans,
Americans.
because they They
The
were 'cause-
Japanese were already in Thailand then.
I see. So
It was the Americans that bombed us.
okay.
When we went to Nakhon Ratchasima, I was,
5 years old.
no, I was 9 or 10.
9 or 10. Okay.
Right.
All right. This is 43 and 44 or 41 to 45?
Yes, it was 40.
1 or 42 to 45 probably.
I remember my parents talking to some friends. I think that was when Roosevelt died. We were still up in Korat,
Okay, he died April 12th of 1945.
45.
45 is when he died, but you were there before that. You were up
We
in
were
that.
there before, yes. Now the Air Force in Korat was the other name for Nakhon Ratchasima. The airport was
The same
shared-
place we're talking about. It's northeast of Bangkok, 120
Right.
miles. It's got several names, but like we've called it here,
Nakhon Ratchasima.
Ratchasima.
Right.
That 120 miles north, where your Air Force was located. So the
Right,
Americans
and
couldn't find you.
It was a small Air Force, but then they expanded it because they moved everything from Bangkok. My father became head of repair division of the Air Force, and at noon every day there'd be a plane overflying the city. And you couldn't see it, you could hear it. It was so high you couldn't see it. And they were taking photographs,
American planes?
American planes.
Trying to find out what you were doing. They were spy planes, yeah.
And my father told me that one day he decided he put out an order saying the roof was rusting. It had corrugated iron sheeting. He said, he got word from the underground that Americans wanted to see what planes he had in the hangars. So he went out on an inspection and decided the roofing was rusting. And so they took the roof off and repainted and painted.
But it allowed the spy planes to see what you had.
Yes.
They wanted to know what.
They wanted to know what.
Yeah. So he was really siding with the Americans.
He was fighting. And on another occasion, he was having lunch with a pilot who was trained at MIT also. And they were having lunch, and a Japanese colonel came up to them. Colonel came up to the pilot and said, "I'd like you to come with me. I want to show you something." And the Japanese didn't like the sound of that and turned to my father and said, "Will you come along?" And my father said, "Okay." And he didn't like that sound either, but he couldn't refuse his friend. So they got in the Japanese plane and they flew for some time, I don't know how long. And he made a pass and said to the Thai pilot, he said, "What's that down there?" Thai pilot said, "Looks like a runway." Japanese said, "What runway? What airport?" Thai said, "Shouldn't be an airport there. Shouldn't be a runway there." And that's all. They flew back. And my father said he was surprised that they got off. But it was a runway built by the Free Thai to supply, to drop agents different places.
Because in 44, I think there was more of a movement that on the American side for Thailand. About 44, the sentiment changed
They were,
away.
the Americans were thinking of crossing Burma into Thailand from India. And that's where the bridge over the river Kwai, that's what they were building. The Japanese wanted to go into Burma. to go after the India.
Yes.
Now, one summer, I can't remember how old I was, probably 10 or 11. I think I was harassing. I was a pain to my sisters. I had the two twin sisters, and my mother complained to my father that I had nothing to do and was being a pain. So my father decided to take me to work with him. Now the airport had one long runway. The Japanese had one side of the runway, buildings, everything on one side of that were occupied by the Japanese. The Thais had the other side of the runway. And at night, patrols the Thai side would go across to the midline of the airport, of the runway, and the Japanese would come meet in the middle, and they'd both back off. During the day, the Thai had their water-cooled machine guns pointing up in the sky, anti-aircraft guns. But at night, they lowered them towards the Japanese. The Japs didn't trust the Thais, and the Thais didn't trust the Japs.
Yeah.
When my mother started complaining to my father about my behavior, he said, "I'll take him to work with me." Now, so I went with my father to the Air Force and had the run of the hangar. I could climb in any airplane and wiggle the sticks, and the men working there helped me. They're like I was a colonel's son, you know. I was top dog son. So it wasn't until I looked at the panel on a Fairchild plane that I saw all the bullets in there. And I realized that if I pressed the wrong button, I figured you'd have to turn a switch on first and then there was a trigger on the control stick. But I just froze. And then one of those days, I went into my father, he was at his desk, and I said, "I'm hungry." My father said, "I'll take you to lunch, but I need to finish signing these papers." In the meantime, we heard a plane, and my father said, "Why don't you go out and see what plane that is?" And I went out and then saw the plane taxi behind the hangar. And I'd never seen a plane go behind the hangars. So I followed it. And the engine shuts off, a Thai pilot climbs out. It's a single-seater biplane, a Curtis Hawk retractable gear. And Thai pilot climbs out. And then much to my surprise, an Englishman comes out from behind the seat of the side of the seat. Apparently there's a baggage compartment, and he was in the baggage compartment, and he climbed out. I could tell he was British. He had khaki shorts on, stockings that came up to his knees, and he was beat red. He'd been in the sun. So I run back into the office, and I said, Dad, there's a white guy coming out of the plane." And my father said, "Okay, you saw it, leave it alone, don't mention it to anybody." He made nothing of it. And later on I asked him, was that one of the CIA or well, they didn't have CIA, they had OSS then, or the British counterpart of the OSS.
What's OSS stand for?
Office Strategic Services.
I see.
That was the precursor to CIA.
I see.
And later on he said the Thais were ferrying these agents all over the place. and the Japanese were getting suspicious, they would all fly the Thai plane to see if there was anybody in there else other than the pilot. So at the end of the war, we all went back to Bangkok. My father, there was nothing for the Air Force to do, because we had American planes, but they were pre-World War II.
Yeah.
And we had some Japanese planes that they didn't want to fly, so the Air Force was, and my father decided he wanted to leave the Air Force. Standard Oil was looking for somebody to run the aviation section because they had come back into Thailand after the war, and so he joined Standard Oil.
And then he did that the rest of his life.
He did that the rest of his life, yeah.
And then, where
Actually,
did
Standard Oil came in two. There was a joint company of Standard Oil New York and Standard Oil New Jersey. Standard Oil New York provided automobile products like Mobile and Flying Horse. Standard Oil New Jersey provided Esso products.
And then when did you come to the United States, or when did your mom and dad and you had two sisters, twin sisters? Tell us how you evolved. And what Thailand lost about 4,500 soldiers in World War II, so there was not a lot of battles in Thailand.
They did not do much fighting.
Because the Japanese sort of occupied, but they wanted it as a walkthrough down to Indonesia and even over to Burma.
Right.
They didn't really want to fight you. And there really wasn't a lot of fighting in Thailand at that time. You were just in the middle of everything.
No. Before we moved to this city,
Evansville, Indiana?
no, to
What city?
Nakhon Ratchasima.
The one northwest. Yeah, before you moved there, yes.
My father had a friend who lived in the suburbs of Bangkok, way out. And he invited my parents, us, to stay with him because they were out of the country, he wouldn't be attacked. And one day, we stayed there probably a couple weeks.
This was after the war was over.
No, this was before, right after the invasion, right after the Japanese came.
Oh, I see. Way back in 41, right? That for you, because you were there December 8th all the way to 42. You had to hide somewhere. I see. The Japanese were coming in then. That's when you lost the 4,500 lives, probably.
Right.
And you escaped in that suburb.
Right.
Yeah.
A bunch of a company of Japanese soldiers came by and camped in the rice fields right near to where we were staying. And I went out to see them. And they spoke English. The officers spoke English. The first bunch of Japanese officers were gentlemen. They were classy. They spoke English, and I was impressed. I went home and told my mother, because they couldn't speak Thai and I couldn't speak Japanese, so we spoke in English. And I said, oh, these guys are... And also, one of the fellows who went to MIT with my father, his parents lived upstream on a river, and he and my father discussed what was going to happen to my mother, being French, and living in an Air Force compound. What would the Japanese say or do? They didn't know how the Japanese were going to treat foreigners. But my mother said she could all speak German to them. Claiming that she was German. Anyway, his parents lived on a houseboat on the river, a different river than my father. And he said, why don't we send Marguerite, that's my mother's name, upstream to live with my parents for a few days to see what the Japanese were going to do. So my mother, my two sisters, and a maid got on a boat and went upstream halfway there, my mother was sitting on the gunwales, out the edge of the boat, and I was sitting next to her and my two sisters, and then somebody at the head of the bow in front of me said, "Japanese coming!" And a Thai fellow, you could see way far ahead, a Japanese boat with big flag coming downstream. One of the Thai fellows, who didn't know my mother at all, said, "Ma'am, you better move inside." And I was, to this day, admire the guy. For him to tell my mother to be safe, it was none of his business. "Ma'am, please move to inside. The Japanese are coming." As it was, the Japanese boat just passed us by, and I don't even know whether they saw my mother or not.
But she was a Westerner. Looked like a Westerner, and they may have thought she was a American or
even with French.
Yes,
they
didn't want those people. They could have attacked your boat if they saw her.
Right, but my mother was. She was more, having stayed in the U.S. for 14 years. She was more Americanized than.
Yeah.
And right after the war, my father became liaison officer between the Thai Air Force and the American Air Force. And they had movies. The house that the pilots who flew the hump, if the plane stopped in Bangkok, they would have a place to stay. And that place had American food. I mean, all the chocolates and everything. My father had PX privilege because he was liaison officer, had PX privilege with the American Air Force, and he'd bring canned goods back home. My mother fell in love with a can of sauerkraut. He bought sauerkraut home one day and cake and.
But that was not really the route for the hump, was it, to land in Bangkok, where people, because the hump they would go from India to China, but I guess from China they'd come down to Bangkok or go from India to
Europe.
Europe.
I don't know what the ATC, Air Transport Command, would land. And they also had movies every night, and some nights my father would take me and my mother to watch the movies, and invariably an American officer sitting there would talk to my mother and said, "What state are you from?" She had an American accent.
Yeah. Chicago, Illinois, yeah. And then how did you get to the United States, and how did you get such a good education, and what your two sisters, how'd they get educated too?
When I was 17, the New York Herald Tribune newspaper, it was still being published in New York then, competing with New York Times. In New York Times.
So this is 1952 about.
This was 52, yeah. New York Herald Tribune was having an annual meeting for students all over the world called the New York Herald Tribune Forum for High Schools. And they would select different countries, like 10, 15 countries, to send one student to New York to live in an American family, and at the end to have a meeting, a forum. So the year 1952, they had a forum, and Thailand was given the choice of sending 2 students. So Thailand had exams all over the country for students who had some knowledge of English and wanted to come abroad. And each school would send a student, and each province would send a student or two, and I sat for the exam, and I spoke English ever since I was a kid, so I didn't have any trouble. One of the exams was an article from the Reader's Digest, and my mother subscribed to the Reader's Digest. Well, they had this Fulbright teacher read a story from the New York Herald Tribune in an American accent, just to know how the kids could understand it. It was a story about some lady saying that she went into a store in Texas, and there was a guy buying a Stetson, and he came out, bought a hat, came out of the street and jumped on it, and then brushed off the dust and put it back on. And they asked the question, they had to be answered, what was a Stetson? Well, none of the kids knew what a Stetson was. I read Digest every month, and I knew what a Stetson was. There were a few questions like that, and so I won hands down.
Yeah.
And I came here and stayed in the New York area.
Where'd you go to school then? And
I went to school for 2 weeks. And I went to school in Brooklyn, Deerfield, Massachusetts, Taft Academy, 2 other schools in New Jersey. It was sort of fun.
you jumped around every 2 weeks to a different school?
2 weeks I'd go stay.
Was it high school or college?
High school.
Was it high school? It says your senior year, you were jumping around everywhere.
Right.
You learned something each place, didn't you?
Yes. I learned that kids at Deerfield Academy, which is a private school,
Yeah.
were entirely different than the kids in Brooklyn. The kids in Brooklyn talked about baseball, and the kids in Deerfield Academy talked about going to Bermuda.
And so then that was a year when you were 17, then you went back to
I
Thailand?
went back to do my senior year in high school. This was between
Junior and
vacation. Yeah, it was vacation time in Thailand.
And so then you finished your senior year. Then when did you come back to the United States, or how'd you
I
get
was
trained?
here
You
for 3
trained
months and went back to Thailand. I took 2 years of pre-med and then went to med school
in Thailand,
in Thailand.
and then you graduated after 2 years, and about 4 years of medical school. Then you're a doctor in Thailand or a doctor in the United States?
Doctor in Thailand. Actually, I did 5 years of med school. At the end of my first year in physiology, the professor of physiology wanted 2 students to be assistant instructors. But you had to repeat the year.
Yeah.
So I started over and asked my parents, and they said, you do what you want.
Yeah.
So I studied, first year I studied physiology and gross anatomy. And then the second year I was supposed to study pharmacology and
Pathology.
not gross anatomy, microscopic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I repeated that, and I graduated a year after my classmates.
And then you do a surgical residency there, or did you?
I did 2 years in surgery there.
In Thailand, in Bangkok,
Thailand,
at Bangkok, at the hospitals there.
Right.
Then when did you come to the United States?
And then, right about that time, there were about 5 Thai doctors who had come back from the United States. They'd done a residency or a year or 2, and had they were. It was totally different. The old school and the new school. Mm-hmm. The new school was more technical, more advanced. The old guys were, and I like the new guys.
Yeah.
What they had done in those days, the University of Pennsylvania had a graduate school of medicine where guys doing residency at general hospitals, not university hospitals, could take a year and brush up on their basic science, and then sit for the boards. But so a lot of the Thai guys were coming to Philadelphia, attending the graduate school of medicine, and then either going back or taking a residence somewhere. The graduate school of medicine was, if you continued another year, you could work towards a PhD in surgery or whatever. And the classes were good. Let's say you had subspecialties, GI, oncology, pulmonary, and all that. And let's say they were going to, the lecture was on colon surgery. If the lecture was on the colon, you'd have the GI guys listening and the surgery guys listening. So I applied for that and got accepted. In the meantime, I also applied for a first-year residency in surgery at the University of Pennsylvania. I got returned. The university, the graduate school accepted me, but the residency university hospital said they were filled. So I came here to attend the graduate school of medicine. I stayed with, the university assigned a host family for me, and I stayed with the host family, who was an orthopedic surgeon. And he said, "What are your plans after the graduate school?" I said, "I'm going to apply for residency." He said, "Have you thought of the University of Pennsylvania?" I said, "I did apply, but they didn't accept me." And he said, "You can always apply again." And I said, "Okay." So I reapplied. I called on the telephone and said, "I want to reapply." And the secretary on the other end heard her talking to somebody. He says he had applied but was rejected. Now he wants to reply again. Her voice was so dubious. And I thought, oh shit. Well, a few days later I get a call. Actually, it was well into the graduate program that I got a call. I was starting to apply different places, and they said the professor would like to interview you. So I went, and well, it was my luck. One of the guys they had accepted for a residency got sick and couldn't accept, so they were empty, so they had one space, so they asked me if I wanted to join. I said sure I would, but by then I had the staff at the university was the same guys.
They knew you because you were working in the research.
Yes.
Yeah, they knew you. They already knew you were good.
That helped.
So then you graduated from your residency program there, and then how did you get to Evansville?
Well,
How'd you meet Marty?
Marty is from Marion, Indiana.
Uh-huh.
When I finished my training, a friend, another resident, his father was retiring, and he wanted to sell his practice to somebody else. And I went to visit it, and he was going to take a 25% of my income, whatever he didn't have to work at all. He just had 25%, and I didn't like that idea. Dr. Rhodes, my professor, the chairman of the department, interviewed me and said, "What are you planning to do?" and all that. And I said, I was looking at a resident, taking over Dr. So-and-so's practice. And Dr. Rhodes looked at me and said, he's a Quaker. He said, "Sorry, I don't think I do that." So I started looking around, and well, the Davis Clinic in Marion, Indiana, was advertising for a surgeon. So I applied and went up to visit them, and they had a Davis Clinic, and I didn't know much about it, but it seemed pretty good. And I applied and accepted and came up to work here. And Marty was back home from school. She was going to Ohio Western and was working in the lab there. And I went down to after a few days at Davis Clinic, I said, I need to meet some girls. So I thought, where would I find girls? Probably in the X-ray department or the lab. So I went to the lab.
And there she was.
And Marty took me around,
Yeah.
introduced me to all the girls.
Yeah.
And 2 days later, I called down to the lab and I say, "May I speak to Martha? May I speak to Marcia?" And Marty answered, and I recognized the voice, and I said, "You want Martha or Marcia?" I said, "I want to talk to you." And then I asked her if she would go out and have dinner with me. And she sort of stuttered, and I thought she was going to college, and I thought, this girl never been on a date before, or what? Turned out she thought I was married.
But she finally told you yes and went out to dinner?
She went out and took her to a place that didn't accept credit cards.
No money.
I didn't have any money.
She had to pay?
She paid. It was, I don't know, $14 or something. And then at the end, I found out that the Davis Clinic and the town's doctor didn't get along.
Yeah. So your job wasn't ideal. They didn't want you doing all that surgery, so they wanted you out of there.
So a guy in Dayton, Ohio was looking for a partner to do his chest surgery with him. So I went to look and I joined him. Mm-hmm. I'd stayed there, I think, 2 years. Mm-hmm. And we had some disagreement. We were doing open heart surgery, but he would have to borrow the pump. Dayton had 4 hospitals, and he'd borrow a pump to take to the one hospital to do a bypass, and then return the pump. So I said, why don't we buy our own pump? Because there was another group had their own pump. And hi.
Not on camera?
Well, yeah, Miss Marty, his wife just showed up. It was Marcia or Martha, but it's Marty. Marcia, she worked at the lab. We just got to the lab, Marty, in Marion. We just got to the lab. We just got past that. Now we're getting past. Go ahead. So now we're at Dayton and the bypass machine, so they didn't want to buy another one, so.
The bypass machine was about $10,000 in those days.
Yeah.
And I said, you could have a higher tech, and well, he didn't want to do that. And so we weren't doing very much. And then I went to a meeting in Chicago, and different hospitals had a display.
Yeah.
And St. Mary's had just built their building.
That'd be 1956. No, what year did they build that? They built the hospital in 56. You're much later than that. You're in the 60s.
This was
late 60s or 70s.
in the late 60s.
Yeah.
70s.
Yeah, 70s. What building they must just build probably surgery suite or something, yeah.
And they offered to guarantee my salary. And I came and worked for a year. Did some emergency room work. Dr. Heimbaugh
Yeah.
worked there one day a week and asked me if I wanted to work in the ER 24-hour shift. And I said, okay, I'll try it. And that was good because right away the clinic doctors came and told me that if the patient wasn't a clinic patient and I could dispose of him, please do so. So, you know, an appendix come in at midnight, I'd admit him and schedule him for surgery at 6 in the morning, and
You'd do it.
I'd do it.
Wow.
And then after about 3 years of that, I think one day Ralph Carson saw me in the lounge and asked me if I wanted to join the group. I came home and told Marty, I said, Dr. Ralph Carson asked me if I wanted to join the group. She said, oh, that's a very well-known group.
So it was Carlson and Hoover, Guy Hoover at that time.
Hoover, Carlson,
And Heimbaugh probably. Heimberger, yeah. Those are the three of the best surgeons in town. They wanted you to join.
and Doc Nabel,
Not able to, yeah.
then Hoover, two Hoovers, and then,
The younger Carlson and later, yeah.
yes.
Yeah. Wow, what a heck of a story. Well, how about any things that, in general, what do you think about, we talked a little bit about War II. What do you think about the United States, World War II, and Thailand, and your philosophy of that? We have very few philosophers from Thailand that have seen all that world and also this world. You got any words of wisdom? Words of wisdom about Thailand and the relationship with the United States and how you think that helped you develop.
I think it was largely luck.
Yeah. And your dad had good brains. Your mom had good brains. You were well bred. You had good genes, but also, you know, you were probably taught a lot of good things.
I had one professor who was trained in England, and when the war broke out, he parachuted back into Thailand as underground. And
You sit there.
in those days, the English gave all these parachuters nugget, gold nugget.
To barter with when they got there, they had to have money, and that they could barter
money.
with that. Yes.
Well, the natives in Thailand, the Thais, found out that these guys carried nuggets, so they were killed for the nuggets. Later on, my professor came parachuted into Thailand with a gold nugget. His supply parachute landed on the village chief's house. And they came looking for him. Well, they found him a mile or two away. He knew that it wasn't safe to carry a gold nugget around. They had tamarind pods that are hollow, and you can eat the meat inside. Put the gold nugget in the tamarind pod, and when they searched him, he'd carry the tamarind pod in this hand and shift it to this hand. They never found it. But later on, the English government ordered a company by the name of Thomas de la Rue to print duplicate banknotes, 100 baht notes, which is, in those days was quite a bit, to print a bunch of 100 baht notes, and gave the 100 baht notes to the parachuters. Now, the banknote had two signatures on it, the Bank of Thailand chairman and the Minister of Finance. One signature was printed in England, the other signature would be printed in Thailand. That's the usual way to do it. But in this case, the English had to print both signatures because they were going to give it to the parachutists. So one employee of the Bank of Thailand, his sharp eyes picked up the signature that the one was much sharper than the ones that are original, because so he realized it was a fake, and he kept his eye out, and sure enough there were more of them coming through. And at the end of the war, the Thai government sued Thomas de la Rue, I think, for counterfeiting banknotes.
Wow. Well, I appreciate all the time, and War Museum appreciates the time. I think it's very interesting. We've been trying to do this for a year or two, but now we got it done. And I'll get you a copy of this for your wife and 2 kids and yourself, grandkids, and then I'll put it at the museum archives, genealogy archives, and on YouTube, if that's okay with you. Is that okay if we copy this and put it up on, let other people see it?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Hey, Santi, tell us about the B-24.
We were bombed while we were in Nakhon Ratchasima. My father was cooking, and I was in the house, and I heard some planes, and I said, "Planes!" I jumped off the house, and my father yelled after me, "Don't go out!" He probably recognized the sound that wasn't Thai planes. So we ran back into the plantation behind the house. After grabbing a few bags that my mother had prepared, one had medicines in it, the other one had blankets, and another one had some clothing. We grabbed that, ran back into the plantation behind the house, and the plane made one pass, and I think on the second pass, while my father and I were in a ditch facing upwards, and my sister and mother were also in the ditch, but facing downwards. We were looking up into the sky, and I could see a whole row of planes with their bomb bays open, and either 7 or 9 bombs came down.
Did it hit your house?
No, the bombs were released right over our head, and my father said, "We'll be all right. It's going to land somewhere else." And sure enough, it landed, I don't know, a mile or 2 down the road on the railway station. But and the bombs kept exploding all night long. They had time delay fuses. Some of them exploded right away, but a number of them kept exploding all through the night and for days afterwards.
But the railroad station was an important hit. They probably had a direct hit.
Yeah, the railroad station was sort of pretty much destroyed.
Was that the Americans?
It was American planes. These were American planes.
Was it
there were
in
4 engines, so I suspect they were B-24s.
Was it 1942 or 43?
I don't know.
Yeah. Wow. Boy, when you saw them drop right on you, then your dad knew it was going to land not on you, it'd be further
Right.
down. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Santi. Appreciate it now.